The air crackled with an otherworldly chill as the human male, his breath forming frosty clouds in the dim light of 2 moons hanging low over the alien terrain, stared at the figure before him. She was unlike anything he had ever seen, a being of ethereal beauty and commanding presence, her skin shimmering like liquid silver under the pale glow of their celestial companions. The princess of this strange world stood there, her long limbs draped in flowing garments that seemed to ripple despite the stillness of the atmosphere around them. Her eyes glowed faintly, a deep violet hue that pierced through him, not out of malice but curiosity mingled with urgency. "Stop talking, human," she said, her voice melodic yet firm, carrying an undertone of exasperation. "We are freezing. Let us get into my room." Her words were not harsh, but they brooked no argument. He hesitated for only a moment, torn between awe and confusion. This planet, her planet, was nothing short of surreal. Towering crystalline structures jutted from the ground like frozen lightning bolts, refracting the moonlight into dazzling rainbows that danced across the icy plains. Yet beneath its mesmerizing surface lay an unrelenting cold so intense it gnawed at his bones. His survival suit, designed for extreme environments, offered little respite against the biting winds that howled intermittently, carrying with them shards of ice sharp enough to cut steel. She turned on her heel without waiting for a response, her movements graceful yet purposeful. Each step left faint impressions on the frost-covered ground, glowing softly before fading away, an effect he couldn't begin to comprehend. Reluctantly, he followed, his boots crunching against the brittle surface. The silence between them stretched taut, broken only by the occasional groan of shifting glaciers in the distance. Despite himself, he felt compelled to speak, to ask questions about where they were going or why she had brought him here in the first place, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the weight of her gaze when she glanced back at him briefly, warning him without words to remain quiet. Or maybe it was the sheer alienness of everything surrounding him, the oppressive vastness of the landscape, the eerie hum of energy coursing through the air, the knowledge that he was utterly out of his depth. As they approached what appeared to be one of the towering crystal spires, he noticed subtle details he hadn't seen before. Tiny fractures within the translucent material pulsed rhythmically, almost like veins pumping lifeblood through the structure. It wasn't just architecture, it was alive, or at least connected to some kind of consciousness. She reached out toward the base of the spire, pressing her palm flat against its smooth surface. A cascade of lights rippled outward from the point of contact, spiraling upward until the entire edifice lit up like a beacon. Without hesitation, she stepped forward, disappearing into the wall itself as if it were made of water rather than solid matter. He froze, staring at the spot where she had vanished. For a heartbeat, panic clawed at his chest. Was this some sort of trap? Should he follow her blindly into whatever lay beyond? But then he remembered her earlier command, "Let us get into my room," and the certainty in her tone. Taking a steadying breath, he stepped forward, bracing himself for whatever would come next. The sensation of passing through the barrier defied logic. It was neither solid nor liquid, neither warm nor cold, it simply was. One moment he was outside, shivering in the unforgiving embrace of the alien night, and the next, he found himself inside what could only be described as a sanctuary. The space was vast yet intimate, filled with soft ambient light emanating from floating orbs suspended in midair. The walls shimmered with iridescent hues, constantly shifting colors as though alive with emotion. In the center of the room stood the alien princess, already shedding her outer garment, revealing sleek attire beneath that hugged her form like a second skin. For all its strangeness, the chamber radiated warmth, not just physical heat but a sense of safety, of belonging. And yet, as he took another step forward, he realized that while the temperature here was more bearable, the tension between them remained palpable. Whatever reason she had brought him here, it clearly wasn't casual hospitality. Something deeper, darker, loomed beneath the surface, hidden for now behind those luminous violet eyes. "You humans," she murmured finally, breaking the silence. Her tone carried both amusement and disdain, though whether directed at him specifically or humanity as a whole, he couldn't tell. "Always so eager to fill the void with noise. Do you fear silence so much?" He opened his mouth to respond but caught himself, recalling her earlier directive. Instead, he simply shook his head, unsure if she'd understand the gesture. To his surprise, a flicker of approval crossed her features, or perhaps it was relief. She gestured for him to sit, pointing toward a cushioned platform that hovered inches above the floor. Hesitantly, he complied, sinking into the surprisingly comfortable surface. As he settled, she paced slowly around the perimeter of the room, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. "I didn't bring you here for idle chatter," she continued after a pause, her voice softer now, tinged with something akin to weariness. "There's a problem. One I can't solve alone." Her admission startled him. Up until this point, she had seemed untouchable, almost godlike in her composure and authority. But now, cracks began to show, not literal ones, but fissures in the armor of invincibility she wore so effortlessly. There was vulnerability in her words, a plea buried beneath layers of pride and duty. He wanted to ask what the problem was, how someone like him, a mere mortal plucked from Earth's mundane existence, could possibly help her. But again he held his tongue, sensing instinctively that interrupting her would only drive her further away. She stopped pacing and turned to face him fully, her glowing eyes locking onto his with such intensity that he felt pinned to the spot. "Do you know what it means to carry a burden too great for one person?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before he could even consider responding, she waved a hand dismissively, as though anticipating his answer. "Of course you don't. Your kind is fleeting, fragile. You live for moments, not centuries. But we—" She trailed off, her expression darkening. "We endure. And sometimes, endurance becomes its own kind of prison." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, thickening the already charged atmosphere. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to process what she was saying, or why she was sharing it with him at all. Was this some sort of test? A riddle wrapped in metaphor? Or was she genuinely seeking solace, however small, from someone who couldn't possibly comprehend the scope of her struggles? Before he could dwell on it further, she moved closer, crouching down to meet his gaze directly. Her proximity was overwhelming, not because she intimidated him physically, but because her presence seemed to fill every corner of the room, every crevice of his mind. "I need your help," she said simply, her voice steady despite the turmoil simmering beneath the surface. "But helping me will require sacrifices, things I cannot guarantee you'll survive." At those words, a chill ran down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the frigid temperatures outside. For the first time since arriving on this alien world, he truly understood the gravity of his situation. Whatever role fate, or chance, had assigned him, it was far more complex than he'd imagined. And yet, despite the danger lurking in her cryptic warning, he found himself nodding slowly, silently agreeing to hear her out. A profound silence enveloped the room, broken only by the gentle hum of the floating orbs casting their soft luminescence. The alien princess straightened, her posture regal yet weighted with an invisible burden. She began to pace again, her gait slow and deliberate, each step echoing softly against the crystalline floor. Her shimmering gown swayed with fluid grace, catching the light in a way that made her seem almost spectral. The man watched her intently, his mind racing with questions he dared not voice. What could possibly trouble a being of such power and poise? What secret did she guard so fiercely? Finally, she paused near one of the glowing orbs, reaching out to touch it lightly. The orb flared brighter for a moment, then dimmed, pulsing rhythmically as though mirroring her heartbeat. "Our world," she began, her voice tinged with sorrow, "is dying. Not swiftly, like a star exploding, but slowly, insidiously. Like a wound festering beneath the surface." She turned to face him, her violet eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You see, our people have always drawn sustenance from the resonance of this planet, the energy that flows through its core, binding us together. But that bond is weakening. The harmony we once shared with this land has fractured." Her words painted a vivid picture of a civilization teetering on the brink of collapse. He could almost feel the tremors of desperation radiating from her, a stark contrast to the serene exterior she maintained. "And you believe I can help repair this fracture?" he asked cautiously, his voice barely audible over the hum of the room. She nodded, her expression solemn. "Yes, though I do not fully understand why destiny has chosen you. Perhaps it is because you are untouched by our world's corruption, a blank slate upon which new possibilities can be written." She moved closer, her gaze piercing. Or perhaps it is something more profound. Something tied to the essence of humanity itself. The man swallowed hard, feeling the enormity of her expectations settle heavily on his shoulders. "What must I do?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The princess gestured towards the orb she had touched earlier. "This," she explained, "is a fragment of our world's soul. It holds memories, emotions, the very fabric of our existence. To heal our planet, we must delve into these fragments, confront the truths hidden within them." She paused, her eyes locking onto his with fierce determination. "Together, we must journey into the heart of our world and mend what has been broken." He felt a surge of apprehension, yet also a strange sense of resolve. This was no ordinary quest. It was a plunge into the unknown, fraught with peril and uncertainty. Yet, the thought of turning away, of abandoning her and her people to their fate, felt inconceivable. "How do we begin?" he asked, his voice steadier now. With a wave of her hand, the princess summoned a swirling portal of light. "We start by stepping into the unknown," she replied, her voice resonant with both fear and hope. "Are you ready?" Without hesitation, he rose to his feet, standing beside her as they faced the shimmering gateway. Together, they stepped through, leaving behind the sanctuary of her chamber and venturing into the depths of the alien world soul. The transition was disorienting, like being submerged in a sea of liquid glass. Colors swirled chaotically around them, blending into forms that twisted and writhed before dissolving into nothingness. Sounds echoed faintly, whispers, laughter, screams, all layered atop one another in an incomprehensible symphony. The man stumbled forward, reaching out instinctively for something solid to anchor himself, but there was nothing. The environment resisted definition, shifting constantly, refusing to conform to any familiar framework. Beside him, the princess moved with practiced ease, her steps sure despite the chaos surrounding them. She extended a hand toward him, her fingers brushing his arm briefly. "Stay close," she urged, her voice calm but urgent. "The resonance can be disorienting." He nodded mutely, gripping her hand tightly as they pressed onward. The sensation of movement was deceptive. Though their legs propelled them forward, the scenery refused to change meaningfully. Time itself seemed elastic, stretching and contracting unpredictably. Minutes might have passed, or hours. Days, even. There was no way to tell. Suddenly, the kaleidoscope of colors coalesced into a coherent image, a sprawling forest bathed in golden light. Trees with iridescent leaves towered above them, their branches interwoven like cathedral arches. The air smelled sweet, carrying hints of flowers and earth. For a moment, the man allowed himself to relax, lulled by the serenity of the scene. But then he noticed something amiss. Beneath the tranquil facade, shadows stirred uneasily, coiling around the trunks like living tendrils. They weren't natural. These were remnants of fear, doubt, anger. Fragments of emotions that had festered unchecked, poisoning the harmony of this world. "This is one of the oldest memories," the princess whispered, her voice tinged with reverence. "It shows what we once were, before the fractures began." She released his hand and walked toward a particularly large tree, placing her palm against its trunk. Immediately, images flickered across its surface like scenes projected onto a screen. He saw glimpses of her people, joyous celebrations, acts of kindness, moments of unity. But interspersed among these were flashes of discord, arguments, betrayals, wars fought over resources and ideologies. "The cracks started small," she continued, her voice growing quieter. "A disagreement here, a misunderstanding there. Over time, they grew, feeding off resentment and mistrust until the entire foundation weakened." She turned back to him, her expression pained. "And now, the fractures threaten to consume us entirely." He approached the tree cautiously, extending his own hand to touch its bark. Instantly, he felt a surge of emotions flood his mind. Not his own, but echoes of those who had lived and died within this memory. Joy and sorrow, love and hatred, hope and despair, all collided within him, threatening to overwhelm his senses. Gasping, he pulled his hand away, staggering backward. "It's too much," he muttered, clutching his head as the emotions lingered, refusing to dissipate. "How do you bear it?" She regarded him with a mixture of sympathy and admiration. "We've had lifetimes to learn how to navigate this labyrinth," she admitted. "But even for us, it is never easy." She stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was cool yet grounding, helping to steady him. "Focus on the present. Breathe deeply. Let the emotions flow through you without clinging to them." Following her guidance, he closed his eyes and concentrated on regulating his breathing. Slowly, the tidal wave of foreign feelings receded, leaving behind a lingering ache but granting him clarity. When he opened his eyes again, the forest seemed less overwhelming, its beauty tempered by the knowledge of its fragility. "We need to find the source of the fractures," she said firmly, her earlier vulnerability replaced by steely resolve. "Only then can we begin to heal them." She pointed toward a distant clearing where the shadows gathered thickest, writhing like serpents preparing to strike. "That is where we must go." Side by side, they ventured deeper into the memory, navigating paths illuminated by shafts of golden light filtering through the canopy. With each step, the tension mounted, the air growing heavier with unresolved conflict. Yet amidst the encroaching darkness, the man found unexpected strength, not just in himself, but in the unwavering determination of the princess beside him. Together, they pressed on, ready to confront whatever awaited them in the heart of the shadowed clearing. As they drew closer to the writhing shadows in the clearing, the air became suffused with an oppressive weight, as if the very atmosphere conspired to deter their advance. The man felt beads of sweat form on his brow despite the earlier chill, each droplet tracing a path down his temple like a silent countdown to confrontation. Beside him, the princess's usual composed demeanor faltered slightly. Her jaw tightened, and her glowing eyes narrowed with a mix of resolve and trepidation. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm, a fleeting gesture that conveyed more solidarity than words ever could. The shadows seemed aware of their approach, twisting and coiling with increased agitation. They formed grotesque shapes, faces contorted in anguish, bodies locked in eternal struggle, all manifestations of the fractures that plagued her world. The man's pulse quickened, his breath hitching as the cacophony of emotions intensified. Fear, guilt, anger, they clawed at the edges of his consciousness, threatening to pull him under. Yet, with each step forward, he clung to the princess's presence, drawing strength from her unwavering focus. When they finally reached the epicenter of the clearing, the shadows converged into a single towering mass, a writhing entity that loomed over them like a storm cloud about to unleash its fury. Its surface rippled with distorted reflections of faces, some familiar, others alien, all screaming silently. The princess raised her hands, palms outward, and began to chant in a language that resonated deep within the man's chest. Each syllable vibrated through the air, weaving threads of light that sought to pierce the darkness. But the shadows fought back, lashing out with tendrils of pure malice. One struck the man squarely in the chest, sending him sprawling backward. Pain exploded through his body, not physical but emotional, a torrent of despair and regret that threatened to drown him. He gasped for air, clutching at the ground as tears streamed involuntarily down his cheeks. Through blurred vision, he saw the princess turn toward him, her expression torn between continuing her incantation and aiding him. "No!" he managed to choke out, shaking his head violently. "Keep going." Her hesitation lasted only a heartbeat before she resumed her chant, louder this time, her voice cutting through the din of chaos like a blade. Encouraged by her determination, the man forced himself to rise, gritting his teeth against the emotional onslaught. Clutching at his sides, he staggered toward the princess, planting himself firmly beside her. Together, they faced the monstrous amalgamation of despair, their combined willpower beginning to push back against its relentless assault. The battle raged on, neither side yielding. The shadows surged forward, attempting to engulf them entirely, but the light woven by the princess's chant held firm, creating a barrier that shimmered with defiance. The man felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal urge to fight for something greater than himself. He reached out, placing his hand atop hers, and to his astonishment, the light grew brighter, infused with a newfound strength. Yet, victory remained elusive. The entity roared, its form shifting erratically, throwing waves of negativity that tested their resolve. Doubt crept into the man's mind. Could they truly prevail against such overwhelming odds? Would their efforts amount to anything more than a futile stand against inevitable destruction? These thoughts weighed heavily, threatening to unravel the fragile thread of hope they clung to. Sensing his wavering faith, the princess turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with eyes that burned with unyielding conviction. "We must hold on," she whispered, her voice steady despite the turmoil around them. "For every fracture mended, there is a chance for renewal. For every shadow dispelled, there is light waiting to shine." Her words reignited a spark within him, banishing the creeping doubt. He nodded, tightening his grip on her hand, pouring every ounce of his being into their shared effort. The light expanded, pushing the shadows back inch by agonizing inch. Hope flickered faintly, a fragile flame in the tempest, but it was enough. Enough to keep fighting, enough to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they could triumph. In the throes of their struggle, a sudden realization dawned upon the man, a truth so profound it sent ripples through his very soul. The fractures they battled were not merely external forces threatening the alien world. They were mirrors reflecting the inner turmoil of its inhabitants. Each shadow, each twisted visage screaming silently in the chaotic vortex, represented wounds inflicted not by external enemies but by choices made in fear, greed, and ignorance. The princess had spoken of betrayal and mistrust, but now he understood. These were not isolated incidents but symptoms of a deeper ailment, a collective failure to nurture connection and empathy. His insight came unbidden, flooding his mind with clarity as vivid as the light they fought to sustain. He turned to the princess, his voice trembling yet resolute. "These fractures, they're born from isolation, aren't they? From the refusal to see ourselves in others." His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, cutting through the din of their battle like a blade slicing through mist. She froze momentarily, her chanting faltering as his observation struck a chord deep within her. Her violet eyes widened, shimmering with a mixture of shock and recognition. "Yes," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "We built walls instead of bridges, fortified divisions instead of fostering understanding. We forgot that we are all bound together, not just by blood or lineage, but by the shared essence of existence." The admission seemed to weaken her momentarily, her stance faltering as if the weight of acknowledgement bore down upon her. Sensing her vulnerability, the shadows seized the opportunity, surging forward with renewed ferocity. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, striking both of them simultaneously. The man cried out as another wave of despair crashed over him, but this time, it felt different. Instead of succumbing to the tide of negativity, he clung fiercely to the revelation that had surfaced. If the fractures stemmed from disconnection, then perhaps healing required something equally profound, reconnection. Summoning every ounce of courage, he stepped forward, releasing the princess's hand and walking directly toward the churning mass of shadows. "No!" she shouted, reaching out to stop him, but he ignored her plea. Standing mere feet from the writhing entity, he spread his arms wide, exposing himself fully to its wrath. "Take me!" he yelled, his voice booming with defiance. "If these fractures are born of separation, then let me bridge the gap. Let me become the connection you've lost." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The shadows hesitated, their frenzied movements slowing as though puzzled by his audacity. Then, with a deafening roar, they lunged at him en masse, enveloping him completely. The princess screamed his name, rushing forward in a desperate attempt to pull him back, but it was too late. He disappeared beneath the writhing mass, consumed by the very darkness they had sought to vanquish. But instead of pain, he felt warmth, a searing, radiant heat that spread through his body, igniting every nerve ending. It wasn't destruction he experienced, but transformation. The shadows began to dissolve, melting away like frost under sunlight. As they receded, he saw fragments of faces emerging from the dissipating darkness, their expressions shifting from anguish to peace. Voices whispered around him, not in cacophony but in harmony, thanking him, blessing him, forgiving him. When the last tendril of shadow evaporated, he stood alone in the clearing, bathed in golden light. The oppressive weight that had suffocated the air was gone, replaced by an aura of tranquility. Behind him, the princess approached cautiously, her eyes wide with disbelief and awe. What did you do?" she asked, her voice trembling. He turned to face her, his expression serene despite the ordeal. I gave myself to the fractures, he replied simply. Not to destroy them, but to remind them of what they forgot, that we are all connected. That division is an illusion, and unity is our true nature. Tears welled in her glowing eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she embraced him tightly. For the first time since their journey began, he felt no distance between them, no barrier of species or origin. They were simply two beings, bound by a shared purpose and an unbreakable bond. Yet, even as the immediate threat subsided, a new question lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Had the fractures truly been healed, or merely subdued? And what price would they pay for the choices they had made? The golden light began to fade, and the clearing shifted once more, dissolving into the familiar glow of the princess's chamber. The man swayed on his feet, exhaustion overtaking him as the weight of what he had done settled in. The princess steadied him, her touch trembling but tender. "You've changed everything," she whispered, her voice a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. He managed a weak smile, though doubt flickered in his eyes. "Have I? Or have I only delayed the inevitable?" Before she could answer, the room shuddered faintly, the crystalline walls pulsing with an unfamiliar rhythm. She glanced around, alarm crossing her features. Something's wrong. The fractures, they're still there. His heart sank, but he straightened, resolve hardening his expression. "Then we fight again. Together." Her gaze softened, pride mingling with fear. "Even if it costs us everything?" He nodded without hesitation. "If it means saving your world, yes." As the chamber trembled anew, their hands found each other, fingers interlacing tightly. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. But the shadows beyond the walls stirred once more, whispering promises of trials yet unseen.